Hey everyone, back with another explanation video on competitive Pokemon. Today, instead of talking about a specific move or a specific Pokemon, I want to talk about a playstyle, or a style of team to be exact, which of course is going to be Hyper Offense. The idea for this video first started when I was working on this team building series I have in the works. I wasn't having trouble describing most of the different team styles in Pokemon because I kind of like to think of it as this sliding scale, you know, where there's this progression from stall to balance to bulky offense to regular offense, which makes it very easy to describe in broader terms. But Hyper Offense, while it does kind of fit on that scale, obviously on this end, is tricky because there are so many specific roles in it that you don't often see in other teams. Plus it requires a very specific way to play the game, either against or as Hyper Offense, that I figured it'd be easier if I gave it its own separate video beforehand. Also, I recently played a bunch of Hyper Offense to finish up my Laddering to Top 500 series on my channel. So if you want to see any of these principles in action and really get to see the nitty gritty of how do you play the offense, be sure to go check out those videos. I'll throw a link to it right here. But hey, this video is going to be long enough as is, so let's just get into it. If you want to skip around the video and just watch certain parts, here are some timestamps for you. But let's get going. Hyper Offense, or HO as it's known, refers to a type of team that has one goal: to sweep the opponents as effectively as possible. So that means things like defensive synergy or hazard removal, recovery, things like that, which are so important to most Pokemon teams, are often not even considered when you're building Hyper Offense. They want to get things off to a quick start, get up their essential hazards and screens to help their sweepers, break some walls right away, then sweep you, the opponent, as efficiently as possible. Now, depending on your definition of Hyper Offense, a lot of different teams get fit under what I just described. Like this team. Doesn't really have much in common with modern metagame Hyper Offense team, but technically speaking, you could still say it's Hyper Offense because of its lack of consideration for defensive qualities in a team. You could also say that a lot of weather teams with 5 offensive Pokemon and a weather setter, like these, fit the description too. It's a pretty broad description, so a lot of teams can be technically classified by it as a result, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be mainly describing standardized Hyper Offense. However, keep in mind that most of what I'm talking about here can be applied to these other teams as well to improve your play with them. In a recent Showdown Live I played, I did my best to play a very aggressive Sand team like I would a standard Hyper Offense and found a lot of success with it as a result. But enough throat clearing, let's get into the components of a Hyper Offense team. You have to keep in mind with this playstyle that all you care about is sweeping your opponent. This makes something like getting up Stealth Rocks and other hazards extremely important. In fact, it is so important that one of the most essential and common components of a Hyper Offense team is its Suicide Lead. These are Pokemon that you throw at the beginning of the game to get up Stealth Rocks and other hazards, and then throw away so you can start generating offensive pressure as much and as soon as possible. Usually, these Suicide Leads have 3 drops. The first is to get up Stealth Rocks and whatever other hazards you can. So generally this can be spikes for additional pressure on grounded opponents, or sticky webs, which reduces the effectiveness of your opponent's faster Pokemon. It can make your own slower attackers much more threatening. These Suicide Leads often have a Focus Sash or the ability Sturdy too, because you need to make sure that you can get these rocks up no matter what. Beyond the usual benefits of hampering your opponent's switches, there's lots of situations where you can sweep your opponent for 88% or like 76%, but not from full health, which makes these Stealth Rocks so important. Their second job is to prevent the opponent from getting up their own hazards. This can mean using Taunt or Rapid Spin, Defog, whatever. It's a huge reason why Excadrill is the most popular Suicide Lead in overuse at the moment. Their third job is to do something to generate some offensive momentum. And I realize that's a very vague description, but that's because there's a lot of ways to go about it. Some use Explosion, or more recently Steel Beam, so they can damage the opponent a little bit and get in their best matchup to force an opponent's switch. This also prevents an enemy from using Defog or Rapid Spin. Similarly, some use Memento to cripple the enemy's attack power and do the exact same thing. Then there's more offensive ways to get momentum. Like Suicide Lead Garchomp's shtick was pretty classic. They get up rocks and then just start blasting. If the opponent was tanky like a Ferrothorn, then they'd boost with the Sword Stance and then start blasting. Aggressive Suicide Leads like this would let your rocker fill multiple roles in your team. I mentioned Excadrill earlier, and they can also use Sword Stance to aggressively threaten, but usually have to give up Rapid Spin in order to do this, so it's a bit of a hard decision. Now, in a lot of the Hyper Offense teams I played in previous generations, like 4, 5, and 6, that was really all there was to Suicide Leads setting up for your team. At least as far as I understood them, at least, you know, I could be wrong. But modern generations of Pokemon, like Sword and Shield and Sun Moon, also feature a screen setter pretty frequently in these types of teams. Usually, it's a fast Pokemon who can get them up quickly to avoid being KO'd first, like Tapu Koko or Espeon, or very prominently nowadays, Grimmsnarl with its Prankster ability, giving these moves a +1 priority. These guys' job is to get up a pair of screens to allow their setup sweepers to come in afterwards and start boosting safely. I talk about this a lot on my Showdown Lives, but from a gameplay perspective, I also find this very interesting because it then creates this cool 50-50 with your setup leads. For example, if I have a physically defensive Hippowdon, and I can see that my opponent is playing a Hyper Offense with Excadrill as a Stealth Rocker, it's going to be an easy decision for me. I'll go in, trade rocks with the Excadrill, and let it take chip from my Rocky Helmet with Rapid Spin afterwards. afterwards, which removes its focus sash, and then I can kill it with Earthquake in one turn. Generally speaking, the Excadrill has done its job here, but it's also about the best case scenario for me playing against the Hyper Offense. But this is exactly where the 50-50 comes in. If my opponent goes into their Suicide Lead Mew instead, I'm in a much more troublesome position. They can taunt me to prevent my rocks from going up, get up screens without much threat at all, and then either go to Excadrill to do its job after I've swapped from my Hippowdon, or go to an attacker right away and save setting up the rocks for later. This adds a lot more ambiguity to the first couple turns as a Hyper Offense player. So yeah, that was a big info dump, I apologize, but understanding the nature of Suicide Leads is important, not just for using them in your own teams, but also when you're playing against them. If you're trying to identify if your opponent is playing Hyper Offense, this is usually a dead giveaway. The first turn is extremely important in Hyper Offense games, and you want to make sure you start as well as possible, no matter which lead you're picking for. Generally speaking, your next job as a Hyper Offense player is to smash open some holes in your opponent's team. Here you can go to like this big bad wall breaker like a Surfetched or a Curium, what have you. Or if one of your setup sweepers has a bad matchup versus your opponent, you can usually go to them here and try to squeeze as much out of them as you can. This is where team building is important. Sometimes in Hyper Offense, I like to have a few dedicated wall breakers, once again like a Curium or a Choice Spike Gengar, whatever. But sometimes I have a team that can kind of gel to fit different roles, like this one, where sometimes the Bisharp goes in and starts throwing around knockoffs right away, once again acting as a bit of a wall breaker. Sometimes I save it for the late game to act as my cleaner with its priority Sucker Punch. And sometimes I save it as a setup sweeper with its Swords Dance. This is true for all of the Pokemon on this team. It kind of gels depending on the situation, and they can fill many different roles. But whether you have set roles in your team or not, it doesn't matter, as long as you understand what their role is in a specific game. To go back to the Bisharp, if my opponent has a bunch of Pokemon that have options to beat my Sucker Punch, I'm not saving it for a late game sweep. I'm going to get it in sooner to bust open some walls right away from my Hawlucha instead. Speaking of Hawlucha, that brings me to the next part of Hyper Offense, and arguably the most important part, the sweepers. These are the Pokemon you keep on your team to win. Everything else on this team is designed around giving this specific Pokemon, or separate Pokemon, the best chances of sweeping the opponent possible. Rocks to chip the opponent, screens to let it set up safely, wall breakers to create some holes in the opponent's defenses, and then the cleaners to mop up whatever could be lingering afterwards. In the current meta, I feel like Hawlucha and Cloyster are the two most popular examples of this, as they both get pretty darn strong and more importantly, very, very fast. But there's really lots of different examples of this, like a Belly Drum, or Clangorous Solkamoo, or Dragon Dance Dragapult, or Swords Dance Mimikyu. Whatever, I could go on. But these are definitely the heart of your team, and you need to keep this in mind, because whichever setup sweeper you choose, you need to build the rest of your team around it accordingly. And I mentioned it a couple times now, but the last role on a Hyper Offense team is typically the cleaner. This is just a speedy endgame Pokemon who can come in and finish up whatever might be left over after your sweepers have done their work. Usually they benefit from a very high speed, so Pokemon like a Scarfed Landorus or a Dragapult or Jolteon back in the day are good examples of this role being filled. These guys can be very helpful early in the game too, as threatening revenge killers to help set up some momentum for your team. For example, let's say I'm playing Hyper Offense and I've just had my Excadrill get up rocks and die to my opponent's Dragapult. I then go to my faster, cleaner Zeraora to threaten it out. But then I make a double switch to my Curium on the Hippowdon, which lets me get off an Ice Beam completely free and grants me a ton of offensive pressure. So these fast cleaners have a lot of utility outside of just the endgame too. Don't get it twisted. And that example also paints a picture of how important smart double switches and smart sacs can be in securing as many opportunities for your offensive Pokemon as possible. So that's enough talking about the components. Let's get into how to play Hyper Offense. I'm hoping this section will be a lot faster than the last one. But first things first, you need to get in one of your Suicide Leads. If you have just one, that's fine. Just go to that. If you have more than one, you need to take the time to guess what your opponent is going to lead with, and then pick your best matchup from there. Getting off to a good start is so important in Hyper Offense, and you can't afford to get stuffed from the get-go by a lazy choice. Once you have your Suicide Lead in, you can either attack your opponent and go for a kill if the matchup's really great, or you can go for your hazards, knowing full well that's not a big deal if your lead dies without doing any damage to your opponent. Next, depending on who your Suicide Lead dies to, you can either go to one of your wall breakers to start throwing out some big hits, or go straight to your other Suicide Lead to finish setting up for your team. And it's here that I also feel obligated to mention that this is just the general framework that Hyper Offense is operated in. For example, in this game, after I play the lead matchup, the normal play would be to just sack my Excadrill, but I actually realized it's got a great matchup versus my opponent, and decided to keep it, despite it not necessarily being the role that I had for it in the get-go. Or, to flip the coin, I just mentioned that you should go to your other Suicide Lead or wall breaker, but hell, if there's a chance for one of your setup sweepers to get a free boost in and has a great matchup, go for it. Pokemon is too flexible a game for me to give you an exact game plan that you should follow in every game, so you need to have a bit of adaptability here. But anyways, let's get back on track. Once you have your wall breakers in, you're going to want to do the most damage possible. However, it's here that I should also mention that if your opponent is a great Pokemon to wall your own, this is the phase in the game where you should be aggressively seeking double switch opportunities. If you don't know what double switching is, here's a link to my video on it, but this is why why it's important to have a strong offensive core that works in tandem with each other as your wall breakers. For example, let's say my two wall breakers are a Choice Specs Aegislash and a Choice Banded Centiscorch. Well, those two aren't really going to work that well together as a combo because my opponent brings a single Incineroar or something similar, then I'm completely walled on both sides. Something like a Terrakion would be a much better core with the Aegislash because it covers its weaker matchups. But offensive and defensive cores are like way too big a can of worms for me to get into in any depth right now, so I'll save that for my future team building series that I mentioned I'm working on. My ultimate point being, once you get your wall breakers in, don't just sit there and click buttons blindly. Try to force more offensive opportunities with aggressive double switching. At Hyper Offense, you've got at least 4 incredibly threatening offensive Pokemon on your team, and it would be a shame to lock yourself into one without taking advantage of other opportunities. Although on the other hand, it leads me to my other point, which is what do you do once your wall breakers have done its job? Hyper Offense teams are obviously designed to be extremely high tempo, so once your Pokemon have done their job and put in some work, don't be afraid to sack them so you can get in your next best offensive option easily. It's times like these that you can easily go into one of your setup sweepers without your opponent being prepared to answer it. Once you do have that setup sweeper in, your goal is obviously to do as much damage as possible. This is the Pokemon that your entire team has been designed around, so hopefully you can put in some major work here. And then finally, if you have any stragglers left over, that's where your cleaner comes in to do the last bit of damage. Nice and quick before your opponent can mount any retaliation. And with that said, that's the general game plan that you should be working with as a Hyper Offense team. I hope that kind of covered it. As for playing against it, if you've watched the video until now, you probably have a pretty good idea of how the playstyle operates, which is already the most important fact. Once you understand what your opponent's going for, you can plan a way to deny these objectives of theirs. A good example of this is if you recognize your opponent is a Hyper Offense team looking to set up rocks with a Suicide Mew, don't just let them taunt your Hippowdon and waste your first couple turns. Go into an offensive Pokemon of your own and put them in this difficult 50-50 decision of trying to taunt you or getting up hazards before you kill them. That sort of thing where you have to put the pressure on them instead. Or another example, if your opponent's Hyper Offense goal is to clear the way for its Scarf Dracovish to sweep, you should be recognizing that, not letting your opponent get kills or damage on your Seismitoad Water Absorber. And one final tip before I finish, when you're playing against or as Hyper Offense, take your time. These games are going to last 15 to 20 turns like tops, so blowing through them like a race is not going to help you at all. Arguably, more than any other playstyle in Pokemon, understanding how your Pokemon individually match up versus your opponents is a massive decider of success. So make sure to take your time and really think through these turns. Don't let an opponent's timer rush you or stress you out. Otherwise, perhaps after much ado about nothing, I will end the video there. Hyper Offense is a very unique style in Pokemon, and with its recent popularity, it's more important than ever that you're familiar with it, even if you're only playing against it. Some people accuse it of being a low skill style gameplay, which maybe I don't super disagree with, but I think making it work at the top level is really impressive, and it can be a great avenue to make some crazy plays if you're bold enough. I also think it's a really great way to learn the game, as it reinforces a lot of very important skills for beginners to pick up, like the importance of hazards, the importance of screens, double switching, understanding one-on-one matchups, how to use and abuse win cons. I could go on. It's a very useful learning skill for newcomers. One final thing I want to mention though is a shout out to this article in Smogon by Mysteria. It was the main inspiration for this video. I definitely took some cues from it, as it's a really excellent, concise breakdown of the playstyle, even if it's 5 years old. It's one of the few very great pieces of information out there to help teach newcomers. So remember really clicking with it when I was first getting into Pokemon. But okay, I think my tongue is gonna go numb from all this talking here. So thanks again for watching. Make sure to throw me a like or subscription. Those are more helpful to content creators than you can know. Thanks again, take it easy.